these are also, if you do research into like QAnon or tools that the Ku Klux Klan uses to recruit people, these are the people they target, which is why I think it's interesting for us to understand sort of what's going on here. But they lost me then when they were like, and the quality of video games is shot through the roof, and that's been a real problem. It's like, could you imagine if I was like, do you want to know why women weren't working that much in the 80s? Fucking the quality of Days of Our Lives was through the roof.
And welcome back. Alyssa, when we started Hysteria, we were side by side. And we try to make it so our conversations like pass the Bechdel test.
Yes.
Two named female characters having a conversation about something besides men. This conversation is not going to pass the Bechdel test because not today, but we do have to do our annual check-in about what's going on with the men. Because there are people that are worried. And some of them are worried about the wrong things and have some pretty bad ideas for how to fix it. But here to talk about those bad ideas with us are our two panelists. You might know our first panelist from her book, You Sound Like a White Girl, but she's about to be so much more than a writer and speaker and activist. It's Julissa Arce, and she's got some news for you.
Hi, I actually have some new news today. I am not trying to get you to buy my book, or maybe I still am.
What?
But besides buy my book, I am just really excited to share that I'm pregnant, and I am.
Yay!
Yeah, I'm expecting my first baby, and it's a girl, so more greatness into the world.
Oh, lucky you!
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I'm very excited. I have had ups and downs of pregnancy, but every time she moves, I'm like, oh my God, I really am going to have a baby. And it's kind of great.
That's awesome. Are you taking like videos of your stomach? Can you see her moving?
No, I can't see her moving yet. Yeah. No,
Okay.
I can't see. I feel her moving, but I can't physically see it. I think it's because, one, my belly's not like as big as I thought it would be at 6 months. I think if you see me from the front, you might not know that I'm pregnant, until you see me from the side. And then it's like, oh, there's something there. But so I don't know. I can't see her move yet. That'll be a treat.
Well, so when I was pregnant, Juniper was super active, and I could see it was like the scene in Alien, like right before the thing was like, bah! She was moving around so much, and I would take videos of it sometimes, because you could see it. And now I went back and watched some of the videos, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's my baby. She's still kind of has the same kind of angry tossing and turning thing that she does, and it's really wild. So that's Julissa. I'm so happy for you. I'm so happy for you and Fernando. You guys are gonna be great parents, and
thank you.
Excited.
Yeah, we're excited.
Yeah, that's so lucky.
Scared but excited, especially watching those labor videos. I'm like,
don't watch them. Don't watch them.
I need to be prepared. I need to know what's gonna happen. But they're scary.
And you don't know what's going to happen. I tried to prepare by knowing everything I could possibly know about pregnancy and labor, and it still was it just kind of all of a sudden it's like being on a roller coaster and you're clicking up to the top and you don't know what kind of roller coaster it is, and there's just no way to know how the rest of the ride is going to go. Is it going to be one of those roller coasters that just drops you straight down? Is it going to be one that's just you just don't know?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's so exciting though.
Thank you.
Rounding out the panel today, our next panelist is also a writer, and if you haven't pre-ordered Immortality, A Love Story yet, you truly ought to. Dana Schwartz, welcome back to Hysteria.
Thank you so much.
Having a book come out is a little bit like having a baby, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same, and I should be entitled to as much respect.
Support
it's
that.
The same. Yeah, no, it's the same as having a baby. No, it's fun. I'm so excited, because my last book came out sort of in the heart of COVID. This is my first book tour. I get to do a book event in person.
Yay.
I'm so
Are
excited.
you going to get to wear the dress, the green dress?
I was going to say the green dress has to come back.
The green dress is going to come out. And I'm not someone who's good at shopping. I've had this same Zara black sweater since college, but I'm trying really hard to buy pieces that are good clothes for an adult, because I'm I'm going to be in front of people. I need like trousers and like a jacket. Like I'm trying to
you don't need trousers.
You don't need
That's
trousers.
my problem. I don't know what
Unless
I
you're
need.
gonna
Maybe
trouse.
some
We don't trouse anymore.
pants. You know what, Dana? Get some slacks while you're at
maybe.
it.
Some
Some
hose-
slacks and a
hosiery.
blouse.
Yeah,
Get a nice
I
blouse.
would say Rent the Runway really was really handy during my book tours because like, you know, like I wanted to wear something different for every event and you're taking pictures and stuff. And so it was kind of nice to have like really nice clothes that then I could like send back and get new, clean, freshly, you know, from the dry cleaners type of clothes. It was nice.
That's a great tip. I also feel like
Recommend.
this is a good excuse for me to get rid of all like the stretched out sweaters that I've had for 10 years.
Oh, and you can like buy. You've done Rent the Runway before, right?
Yeah.
You can
like
buy
the
it if
things you
it.
like.
Yeah, and it's like gently used clothes, but like, who cares?
It's great.
Of course,
I
all
love
the things I like
Ariel.
are like $600, and I'm still like, nope, sending it back.
Now that we've talked about stuff that would be considered by many to be girly, let's talk about men and what's wrong with them, and what's wrong with the way that we're talking about what's wrong with men. So there's an article that came out in the New Yorker this week, and it's a review of a book by Richard V. Reeves, who is a British American academic who studies inequality and social mobility. He wrote a book called Of Boys and Men: Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. So I'm going to read a little excerpt from this review from the New Yorker. Men now confront the prospect of cultural redundancy, Reeves writes. He sees telltale signs in the way that boys are floundering at school and men are leaving work and failing to perform their paternal obligations. All this, he says, has landed hardest on Black men whose life prospects have been decimated by decades of mass incarceration, and on men without college degrees whose wages have fallen in real terms, whose life expectancies have dropped markedly, and whose families are fracturing at astonishing rates. Things have become so bad so quickly that emergency social repairs are needed. Quote, it's like the needles on a magnetic compass reversing their polarity, Reeves writes. Suddenly, working for gender equality means focusing on boys rather than girls. That's what we will call the nut graph in this review. Julissa, I would love to hear your thoughts on this article and the subject matter that the book takes on. What do you think of that passage?
I think that it really illustrates the way that Americans think about many of the problems that plague our country, like always trying to find a scapegoat instead of trying to find real solutions for very real problems. Like all of the things that you mentioned are real problems. Mass incarceration is a problem. The fact that, you know, more men are dying by suicide than any other time in history is a problem. The fact that, you know, men or boys are dropping out of high school and dropping out of college at really high alarming rates is a problem. Like all of those things are real problems, but the source of that problem is not the success that women are having. The source of that problem is not little girls, and the solutions to those problems are not going to be found in women achieving less. Right. So like when I hear the biggest, the people that it's affecting the most is Black men, it so reminds me of when conservatives talk about immigration. Right. And they say Black Americans are the ones hardest hit by illegal aliens taking their jobs. And it's like, no, actually, undocumented people are not to blame for white people losing their jobs. Right. And so I think that my biggest takeaway with this article is just that we are trying to find a scapegoat and trying to find solutions where there are none to be found.
Mm-hmm. Dana, what do you have to add?
I completely agree. I think the problem isn't that like there is some big problem happening with men, but I think the problem is the perceived problem. Like I do think it's a true reality that men are framing themselves, a lot of men, as particularly young men online, figuring out like ways that they are victims and they feel wronged by like this culture war that's happening. And I think that we can get in this like recursive argument about like, you know, are men as a whole suffering changes, cultural changes that are costing them something, or are they just like looking for reasons to justify X or Y behavior. And I feel like it's probably the latter. Like, I don't know. I don't like anything that divides us up in those like arbitrary things. Like, men are people, women are people. Everyone is individuals doing these things. And these like culture war headlines just give fodder to people on the right who are like, go back to traditional values. Like, this headline, for whatever nuance the book has, and particularly for men of color, these communities of color that are struggling, the consequence of this is that racist, white supremacist people are going to read this headline and feel emboldened by their culture war bullshit.
Alyssa, what were your initial thoughts?
So I really went into this article with a perspective like of what I thought it was going to be, and actually I found it really fucking interesting. I think that a couple things. One, I feel like overall when they talk about what's happening, specifically to men, specifically white men in a lot of this, it's like, yeah, guess what, man? Women are thriving because they've had to be resilient because nobody read articles about why we might not be thriving for the last 100 years and taking interest in it. Like, the one thing I found like conflicted about is that I was so interested in what the article had to say, and I was like, no man would have read this article about women 40 years ago and been like, well, this is very interesting. I should learn more.
Yeah, men weren't buying the feminine mystique in droves. They were
that
was not
or
the
Simone de Beauvoir.
Yeah, right.
And the thing that I thought was very interesting was when some of the economists, actually one who I knew, Alan Kruger, who is an incredible, thoughtful man who is the head of the economics department at Princeton. He's since passed away. He was cited in this article so many interesting things. Roughly a third of non-working men reported some kind of disability. Of those men, nearly half were taking pain medication and opioids on a daily basis. And there I was like, this is interesting, because when you actually look at a lot of what they're saying, these are also, if you do research into like QAnon or tools that the Ku Klux Klan uses to recruit people, these are the people they target, which is why I think it's interesting for us to understand sort of what's going on here. But they lost me then when they were like, and the quality of video games is shot through the roof, and that's been a real problem. It's like, could you imagine if I was like, do you want to know why women weren't working that much in the 80s? Fucking the quality of Days of Our Lives was through the roof. And they were just like, you know what? Not for me. But, when they went down that route, I was like, oh, you've lost me. But I did think that much of what was in the article was worth knowing and was interesting and instructive.
I agree.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think that was my main problem with the article is there were interesting points that they made,
right.
But the headline and the illustration, which Liz Plank pointed out on Twitter, which is a woman like leapfrogging over a man, like pushing him down, I think belies the how nuanced the point could be.
I want to go back to something Julissa said when she first started talking. She said that it seems like it is a problem in search of a scapegoat. I agree that like it seems like a problem has been effectively identified. There is a problem, clearly. But then I think about all the ways that solutions that apply evenly to everybody would help alleviate the problem, right? So it seems as though men expect to age into a world that offers them XYZ things, and the world increasingly does not just hand those things to them. They don't turn 22 and like get a wife, and then their wife doesn't just like take care of them like she's mommy the sequel. That doesn't happen because women are like, no, this sucks for me, I'm not doing this for you. They don't automatically get a job where they can work 40 hours a week, clock in at 9, clock out at 5, buy a house on a nice cul-de-sac, raise 3 kids. They don't get those things that they thought were coming to them, right? That they thought they were entitled to, especially like younger men without college degrees. Like you're not going to be able to afford any of that shit. My first thought reading this was like, just get universal health care and universal childcare. Those two things. I mean, it's just as doing a lot of heavy lifting in that because, we would have to dismantle the entire insurance industry and reorder the entire healthcare system. But if we had universal healthcare, I would imagine that these men who are young and on opioids or on disability would be able to better access care that could help them get into a position where they are A, mentally healthier, B, physically healthier, C, not as economically insecure, because, economic insecurity I know runs a lot of interference for things that are definitely not economic insecurity, but they would have their basic needs met. And I think in a country that just repeatedly refuses to address basic needs, like making life better for women and making, one of the things that's highlighted in this article is these men whose families are broken, their wives are leaving them, or people don't want to marry them. It's like all of these things would be slightly more fixed if we just made some systemic adjustments so that things didn't suck so much for everybody. It just seems like, and I don't think, like Julissa also pointed out, the blaming little girls thing, that really kind of stuck in my craw also. Like, I don't know. I think that I don't know if the author meant to imply this, but in reading the article, it felt as though there was a bit of an implication that women need to just like not run as fast, or like not try as hard,
100%,
not do as much.
Foot on the brake.
Exactly. And I don't know how progress is helped when a large group of people hamper themselves. Julissa, you looked like you had something on your mind.
I almost felt like the end of the article was like threatening, like a threat, like the way that, the way it says, like, gender theorists have described a perennial struggle among multiple masculinities. I can't say that word, masculinities. In this scenario, nobody who values the prospect of eliminating gender hierarchies can afford to be a bystander. Masculinity is fragile. It's also malleable. The shape it will assume in the future have consequences. That last sentence was like, are you threatening me? Like, are you?
Well,
like,
right.
what's going
Because
on?
Julissa, and that was my thing, is that it's basically, if you put the pieces together, which I thought was disingenuous in the article, is that when they're talking about this, they're saying they're not, guess what? All mass shootings, or almost all, are done by men, right? When they talk about screen time, they're not saying that also these people are going down the QAnon rabbit hole, and that, like they left out key pieces of sort of what I thought made it also interesting. And the other thing that they didn't really dive into or have a point of view on, I guess. I think that's the thing in this article. The things that I thought were very interesting, they just stated as facts, but they didn't have a point of view on, but they seem to have a point of view on like how women can participate in this. And so one of the things they talk about is, which I thought was so interesting, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has what's called a time muse survey. And they found that in all of these men who were not in the workforce, quote, most of these hours of free time are spent watching screens rather than doing household labor or caring for family members. Instead of socializing more, men without work are even less involved in their communities than those with jobs. Well, okay, so like the women are still, they're doing not just getting ahead at work, but clearly they're still fucking doing all the shit at home too. Mm-hmm. But like there was no judgment about that. It was just like, oh, well, what are you going to do?
Yeah, I felt...
Like, no, that's like fucking crazy. Again, back to Days of Our Lives, I'm just saying.
I mean, here's the thing, is like the expectation is that society should bend toward the way that men are, rather than men adjusting to changes in society in a way that is like pro-social and helpful and healthy. I think a lot about the way that people raise boys, and I think there is a really good point to be made about the way that schooling, especially in like the early years, is really not designed well to deal with little boys. Like I have friends of mine that have like sons, very like good parents. Their little boys are just like having more trouble in school than any of the friends of mine who have little girls. Like, and I feel like there's maybe something that can be done, especially with early childhood education and early childhood development, that incorporates the fact that there are kids that develop at different rates, and that, and instead of like having a one size fits all type of approach to schooling in the early grades, it might be beneficial for us to examine how schooling can kind of meet little boys where they are. I think that that's like a really good point. But I also think there's a problem with the way that like boys are raised to not be self-sufficient. Dana, you're nodding.
It's like I've read articles this week about like working women are drowning because childcare is like a nightmare and disaster in this country. And so I guess it's a little bit harder for me to, empathize with articles where it's like, and men feel bad about like the things that they feel like they're owed. But I was reading the article and I was really surprised that it didn't get into this idea of community. Like it seemed to dance around this idea that men are really lonely and isolated. And I was thinking about how culturally we kind of encourage female community, like women meeting their friends for brunch is like a normal thing, where for young men, I kind of think that socializing, maybe if you're not good at sports, like men can go to sports teams if they're young, but if you're not good at sports, there are fewer like socially sanctioned communities for young men, and they kind of turn to these online communities that are like sexist and self-loathing and awful. And I mean, that to me feels like part of the larger problems of like the lack of neighborhoods, the lack of knowing your neighbors, of society, of culture, like being communal, and everyone's kind of lonely. And I wonder if that's a bigger problem.
Well, and to your point, Dana, though, everybody I feel like everyone knows that. Like Joe Rogan knows that lunatic Andrew Tate knows that. They are preying on these people. Josh Hawley knows that. Yeah. And so it's really like a problem that's out in the open, but people are gaining power and making money by exploiting it.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't think that men are on playing video games because they're like great graphics. I wonder if it's because it's like the way they talk to their friends.
That was a crazy comment.
Yeah, that's I rebuke that.
I also think the article really misses this sort of the difference between equality and like equity, right? Like women, we are so far behind. Like, okay, maybe early childhood education, girls are doing better, thriving. But then when you look at it from sort of like power positions, right? Still like the vast majority of CEOs are men. The vast majority of people in government are still men. The vast majority of people who have any kind of decision-making power, both from a policy standpoint and even from a cultural standpoint, are still men, right? And so how can you make the argument that, okay, women, like you've had enough, you've had enough progress, now we're going to take our foot off the pedal and focus on the men because they're falling a little bit behind, when you look at the bigger picture. And you know, women were still sitting here fighting to get paid the same amount of money for doing the same job. Latinas, for example, make 54 cents on the dollar to what a white man makes for doing the exact same job across different jobs, blue collar jobs, white collar jobs. So it's like, how can you make the argument? How could anybody in good faith make the argument that women have had enough progress and it's time to turn our attention to men because they're falling a little bit behind? Because again, I think it goes back to this idea of scapegoating, right? Like all of these problems that have been identified, the source of that problem are not women, right? Like if you think about, okay, yes, men can no longer go to a 9-to-5 job, work 40 hours a week, be able to buy a new home and retire and sort of have this quintessential American dream. That's not because women are going into the workforce. That's because of our capitalistic, racist society that is hoarding money at the top. You know, the reason why you see CEO pay increase over time. And I love this graph every time I see it. It's like CEO pay and corporate profits, how much those have risen over time and how stages are stagnant. And it's like, you can see, you know, if there were just a little bit less profits, people could actually get better wages and get better jobs. We're seeing it right now, right? Like ExxonMobil just reported like record earnings at a time where like people are getting laid off and gas prices are so crazy. And so you see, like, to me, the source of these problems and where we're going to find solutions for all these men that, you know, are struggling. And I don't minimize those problems because they exist and they do have consequences for entire society, not just for those men. But until we can have an honest conversation about the source of the problems and where to find the solutions, this isn't going to get better. It is just going to continue to get worse.
Dana, you looked like you had something on your mind. You were nodding.
No, I
emphatically.
just totally agreed. I thought that was a really excellent point. I mean, I think there are all these systemic problems. And I wonder if the myth of American meritocracy is kind of coming home to roost. And these sort of mediocre men who kind of never would have been big CEOs successful in any universe, even if they were alive, you know, even if they were Don Draper in the 50s, would always sort of been middle management. Now with inflation and the housing crisis, I mean, no, you can't buy a house. You can't afford a college education. This is like a systemic problem across everyone in America, men, women, families. But I think men possibly, and I'm projecting here, internalize that because they feel like they deserve a certain image of what an American life looks like, even though everyone is affected by the housing crisis, by how shitty, you know, working conditions are, by healthcare costs.
I think it's a combination of feeling like they deserve it, but also that it's expected of them. And like I'm trying to be really empathetic here. I feel as though even forward-thinking progressive men, if they're straight, you know, cis, hetero, whatever, men who want to get married and want to have families, I feel like most of them feel pressure to be providers, even if they know that that's like an outdated idea, even if they know that that's like, you know, whatever, my wife is, I like my wife because she's strong and she can stand on her own 2 feet. I do think that there are a lot of men who feel like they are being judged by other men on whether or not they were providing for their families. And when they can't do that, they can't do that. And I feel like it's a type of humiliation for them. And I think that being constantly in a state of like low grade humiliation, it is easier to just blame the person closest to you. Like, you know, the woman who's lives next door, who's getting her master's degree and has this great job and doesn't have any kids and not a care in the world. It's easy to blame the person closest to you rather than, as Julissa mentioned, the people are hoarding the wealth, which are other men, which are also the men. Yeah, right. Which are also the men that these guys want to impress the most. Like they want to be one of them. They want to be part of the team. So it's like go ahead.
They want to be those men.
Yeah. And like maybe I'm like feeling a lot less empathetic than than the rest of you. But I'm like, by the way, that in itself is a problem of their own making. For centuries, you know, for all of humanity, they have men have made that problem for themselves. They have made this bed that they're lying in now, right? Like they're the ones who created sort of this idea that men should provide, that women should stay at the home. You know, like I just think about like in Latino culture and Mexican culture specifically, but I think more broadly in Latino culture, just how much men are valued, you know, how much more mothers value their sons, how they cater to them, how it's like, you know, if one little thing happens to their son, it's like, oh my God, the world is ending, versus like they do expect women to be stronger and more emotionally stable. You know, like when like families get together, it's like make sure that the dad has a plate of food and make sure that the son has a plate of food. And let's make sure like everything is just about catering to men. And so much of that comes from because, you know, from sort of centuries of, well, men are the providers. So it's our job to like cater to them, to make sure they're not stressed when they come to the home, make sure that we're, you know, making this beautiful home for them and this beautiful meal for them. And so all of these issues that we're talking about now, like, yes, maybe I feel a little bad, you know, that like these men are struggling, but the other part of me is like, well, go talk to your father about this, you know, go talk to your grandpa. Like, don't blame us. Like, it's not our fault. And like, to the extent that we can be helpful, we probably will be because that's how we are.
I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I think there's real value in raising human beings who are going to be self-sufficient when they reach adulthood, whether it's a boy or a girl. And I think girls are raised to be self-sufficient human beings, like for better or for worse. And there is joy, there is pleasure and satisfaction that comes in being able to take care of yourself. Some of my happiest years were when I I'm happy now. Great. No notes. Good life. But when I look back on my life, I'm very happy with the times that I was like able to cook a nice meal for myself, able to keep my home the way that I wanted my home to be kept, not for anybody else, but for me. And I don't think that men are necessarily raised with the idea that they'll ever be responsible for keeping a home. And they probably will be. People aren't getting married now until they're almost 30. I think the average age of first marriage for women is like 28 now. And, you know, in coastal areas and places with like higher education levels, it's higher. So, you know, your sons and your daughters are going to be living in situations where they have to take care of themselves for several years, probably, before they live with somebody else. And I just don't think that there are enough people who are raising boys to understand that.
There was something in this article that I thought, and if I missed it, you guys correct me. I felt like it was just all men. Whereas I think that if there had been some like socioeconomic nuance to this, it might have been more interesting. Because like if you look at like when they're talking about the men who are not working because they're disabled, because they're on disability, because they're taking drugs. It's like, well, I have very little sympathy for, people who were raised with privilege, who were like, this isn't the world I expected, and I'm just checking out. I have very little sympathy for that. But I do think that, like, Erin, over the past couple of months, we've talked about so many unions that have gone on strike. And, like to Dana's point about how, people are raised to think I should be able to, in the 70s and 80s, someone who was a rail worker could provide for a family and have a home and have a nice life. And now when we see what people are striking for who are not as socioeconomically advantaged, you're like, how the fuck can that even be? Like, what do you mean they don't have a sick day? That's fucking bullshit. And so I think that part of what bothered me about this article is that it kind of lumped everybody into one. And I think there are two very different experiences that people are having. And that if you can understand how someone who could be very disaffected, if it's like, I work my ass off, I'm working 40 hours a week, I can't call in sick one day, they want me to do this like physical labor. And the same like with the nurses strike in New York. I mean, Jesus Christ, like we have said these people are frontline workers, they worked all through COVID, and now we're like, you know what? Thanks for your service. So I thought that was one thing that sort of discredited the efficacy, the message, I guess, of the article, is that they kind of treated it all as one. And I think that they're probably two very different stories being told, and that I'm not going to have, and in some ways it's like lumping in, the guy who went to college and had a good education and came out and was like, what do you mean I'm going to make it seem as a woman? I don't want to be part of society. That's a very different thing. And I feel like they're lumping it in some ways with people who are working very hard and struggling. And it has nothing to do with the fact that a woman became a CEO of some fucking company. I just feel like they conflated a lot of issues in this article and oversimplified it in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Next thing you know, they're going to say that women are the ones responsible for the better graphics in the video games.
You know what, Julissa? It is a massive conspiracy. We gave them an opportunity, and they hypnotized men into watching games all the time so they could leapfrog over them.
Doing the work to hypnotize you and hypnotize graphics.